The ocean doesn't care if you believe in climate change. The ocean is going to get warmer no matter what you believe. If we don't get this right, then our way of life is gone.
I have some hope. However, I will say that I am not going to paint a rosy picture. I think it's going to be challenging.
My biggest fear is really that this issue might be even bigger than we realize at this point.
Climate change is the single biggest threat to the survival of this planet. And in Maine, scientists are witnessing and studying the impacts of a body of water that is warming rapidly, right in their own backyard.
It's basically ground zero for climate change, with the Gulf of Maine warming faster than 99% of the ocean. It's happening right here.
The Gulf of Maine is important for two main reasons. One, it supports an incredibly large fishery in terms of lobsters. It's really, really important to the state of Maine. But what's more important, at least to me as a scientist, is it is warming faster than 99% of all of the oceans in the world. Like, this is a test bed for what's going to happen over the next 40 to 50 years all throughout the world's oceans. We suspected it in 2012. 2012 was one of the warmest years ever for the Gulf of Maine, and that's where scientists started looking at how fast the Gulf of Maine was warming. Until then, we knew it was going fast, but we had no idea that it was warming as much as it was. From 1982 to 2012, the Gulf of Maine was warming at about 0.03 degrees Celsius per year, which is a little bit higher than average than the rest of the oceans, but not much higher. But started in 2004 until 2018, it is warming at 4 or 5 times that rate. The Gulf of Maine, you can think of it kind of like a bathtub. And the temperature in this bathtub is being governed by heat from above, but also warm water coming in and cold water coming in. So a hot water faucet and a cold water faucet. And the hot water faucet is, the rivers and everything else. The cold water faucet is the Labrador Current. So the Labrador Current is this current that originates in the Labrador Sea and flows down along Newfoundland and along Nova Scotia, and then part of it enters in the Gulf of Maine through the Northeast Channel. So that's really cold water. Now, the Labrador Current also pushes the Gulf Stream away, which is really warm water. Well, lately, since the early 2000s, the Labrador Current has been getting weaker. So we're getting less cold water coming into the Gulf of Maine. We have also, the Gulf Stream has been moving north, and so we're getting more warm water into the Gulf of Maine. So we're turning down the cold faucet, and we're turning up the hot faucet. And so no wonder the Gulf of Maine is getting warmer.
Those warming waters are one of many factors taking a toll on the Maine lobster industry. In 2018, the value of the state's lobster catch was nearly $485 million. But scientists and fishermen and women are seeing some alarming trends that tell us the boom in Maine may be coming to an end.
We're talking about the most valuable fishery in the nation right now. The Gulf of Maine produces about 90% of that value. The state of Maine produces about 80% of that value. It's Maine's most valuable export commodity. About 75% of our fishery value in the state comes from lobster alone.
My name's Dan Chadbourne. I've lived on the Saco River my whole life. My father was a fisherman before me, so I'm second-generation fisherman. You can see the catch is less. When I was a kid, everything we fished was right in the bay. You could see everybody from here. And now the lobsters are outside because the water's colder. Little guys. Another nice one. There's less. There's almost half of what we used to catch.
We know lobster stocks are moving north. It's unequivocal. There's no lobster fishery really in southern New England anymore.
We've seen mass mortality events in Long Island Sound. And then at the same time, looking to the north, especially in the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence, we've seen this dramatic surge in lobsters there now. They too are entering a sweet spot in terms of conditions favorable to the production of lobsters. And that frontier is only moving northward. If that continues, it can only mean the further demise of that fishery.
We know that coastal communities are the most susceptible to the impacts of climate change. And here in Maine, we know that there is a heavy reliance on one major fishery, which is the lobster fishery.
They're caught in this trap of being so beholden to the debt they're paying on their boats, their houses, their trucks. If this level of production doesn't continue, they may find themselves in a very tight spot.
I'm 52 years old. I'm hoping to get 10 more good years out of this, you know?
As lobsters move north in search of colder waters, so too do other species. And they're being replaced by creatures we've never seen here before.
Lots of migration due to climate change is already happening in the Gulf of Maine. The perfect example here is cod, which is basically gone out of the Gulf of Maine, where up in Iceland they're catching a ton of cod right now. All the cod which was here before.
Ground fish are virtually non-existent as a fishery, and that was a fishery that once dominated this coastline.
In my lobster traps, I'm catching fish that don't belong here. I'm catching triggerfish that belong in Florida, and I've caught so many of them now. It's common. I don't even think about it. I just flip the trap over and dump them out.
Lobstermen here, they frequently report catching now blue crabs in their traps, even seahorses. Black sea bass, all those warmwater species, they become more and more frequent here in the Gulf of Maine now.
We're seeing things that we could have never, ever expected because we're seeing Rhode Island turn into South Carolina, okay, real quick, and us turning into Rhode Island.
Right now, we have regulations, and the regulations are on geographical areas. Well, fish don't care about geographical areas, and they don't care about regulation lines.
We've been seeing that for several years in the Gulf of Maine now. We're having species moving north to look for colder water, such as cod and shrimp. And we're seeing species from down south that we never used to see before, like black sea bass, that are up here. But our management system for fisheries isn't very nimble, right, to respond to that. All of our laws that are responsible for how we manage our natural resources and think about how we access natural resources, they're all premised on the fact that we have good science, we have good data, we have a pretty stable system, we plug the science into management and we crank out results, right? Here's how many fish you can pull out, here's how the stock is going to stay sustainable over the number of years, how many people can prosecute that fishery. So the thing I tell my students all the time is what we know about climate change is that history is getting less and less relevant and geography is getting less and less important.
Now, our fishermen are going to be squeezed because what they normally fish for is going to be gone, and they're going to see these other profitable species, at least for a time, and they're going to be able to fish those, and we have no regulations to tell them how much they can fish, when they can fish, or anything like that. And so that is a recipe for disaster.
Ultimately, I think we will need some changes in the law because it's not built to regulate a really dynamic, changing ecosystem. It's just not. So for instance, in fisheries management, Fisheries are management in federal waters by these bodies called regional councils, and the lines are drawn mostly along ecosystem boundaries. There's the New England Council, there's the Mid-Atlantic Council, there's the Gulf of Mexico Council. But when you have species that are moving back and forth in between them, we have species of squid that are now landed almost entirely by the Rhode Island fleet, but they're still managed by the Mid-Atlantic Council, and Rhode Island isn't part of that council. Is that shift forever, or is it a few years? So again, that's an example where the geography doesn't fit what's going on with the system. The analogy I like to think of is the stepsister trying to get her foot in a glass slipper. It's not a great fit, and it's just going to become a harder fit in the future.
A changing climate will mean changes for all of us, and it will pose very specific challenges for Maine's coastal communities. Not just for fishermen and women, but for anyone who lives or works on the water.
We're having coastal communities flood at times that they never used to flood before, regularly. So it's not like the big hurricane or the big nor'easter, it's a full moon. And Marginal Way in Portland is flooded regularly.
Climate change will completely restructure coastal communities, how close we build to the water, what we can harvest from the ocean.
When looking to the future predictions, that by 2100, in the best case scenario for sea level rise, we will lose 60% of our coastal marshes. If we do nothing about taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, we will lose 90% of our coastal marshes. And so, yes, climate change is going to have a huge impact on these coastal marshes, and in turn, on the fish and wildlife that use them, but on the humans that depend on them for protecting our coastlines.
There's implications in many different directions, whether it's thinking about our infrastructure, how we live on the coast, how we make a living off of coastal and marine resources. So we're seeing it, we're living it right now.
If you look historically going back to 1912, here in Portland we have a known flood stage, which is basically 12 feet mean lower low water. So if you look at your tide tables and you see high tides around 10 feet, there's about 2 feet more. But when you get in that 11.5 foot, 12 foot range, that's when you're going to start to see what we call nuisance flooding, where you're going to see some flooding along areas of Commercial Street, you're going to see flooding along areas of Back Cove, on East Bayside, things like that. If you look at an average, I think the average is about 6 times per year, but that's now up about 10 times per year if you look at about the last 20 to 30 years. You're basically seeing almost a 10-fold increase in terms of the frequency of flood events that are occurring.
How are we going to adapt? What are we thinking about planning for building along Portland's waterfront in the future? We're seeing these different floods, we're seeing different tidal trends. What does that mean when the city is looking forward and planning how and where and what to build on the water?
We have really critical waterfront infrastructure that depends on being on the water. And we have to have that kind of infrastructure adapted to become more resilient if we want it to stay there. The responses are basically protect, adapt, or retreat.
One of the most important things to remember is that climate change isn't going to affect everyone equally. Some communities or individuals are going to be better able to adapt or respond to the impacts of climate change. So as researchers, one of the things that we're focused on is understanding who is less able to adapt or who is more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. As researchers and as policymakers, it's really up to us to figure out how can we level the playing field? How can we help those people who are least ready or least adaptable to respond to the impacts of climate change? One of the tools that we can use are called vulnerability analyses. So this is really trying to tease apart, which individuals in our communities are the most susceptible, or which neighborhoods in our towns should we be focusing on and really reaching out to them, whether that's through education, whether that's through infrastructure redesign. There are lots of different ways that we can try to do that.
For most scientists, the climate change debate is behind us. They say it's now up to the rest of us to do something about it.
I think what you can say to people who really have a problem with understanding that concept is look at the data. I think there are very few issues in the natural sciences which are as well documented with data by so many different people from so many different angles as climate change.
I think at the local level, people are already seeing these impacts. And in some ways, they don't really care whether it's happening because of climate change or not. So they don't have to have that fight. They can just move on. They know that flooding is happening on their street more often, and something needs to be done.
There's great science being done on climate change. There's fabulous science on the Gulf of Maine that's been going on for decades. What do we do with it?
The smart thing to do is think about what areas are at risk now, what areas are going to potentially be at risk in the future, and how do we adapt?
I have hope that people will understand the seriousness of this as we see more and more of the impacts every day in the news.
We know there's a lot of information out there that people could potentially use to make decisions, but oftentimes there's a gap between that knowledge and decision-making processes. Either people can't access the information, they can't understand it, it may be too technical, or the information just isn't what people need.
We just need to acknowledge, yes, there is a problem, and then work on finding a solution. And there might be many different solutions for various different problems.
But what we're seeing nowadays in terms of climate change is it's kind of a new dynamic. You can't necessarily just depend on what happened in the past to predict what's going to happen in the future.
Scientists are playing a crucial role in the fight against climate change through their research. But is the role of the scientists evolving as the risk to our planet becomes greater? Should the scientist also be an advocate for change?
I can no longer sit on the sidelines. I mean, scientists have to be part of this, and we have to work not just with individual people, but with governments and businesses, because they are the ones that create the majority of greenhouse gases.
One of the examples I use in one of my classes is the question about the March for Science that occurred in DC a few years ago. Not all the scientists agreed they should do that. There was two real different schools of thought of that. We are so at risk for losing funding and the government support to do good research that we've got to speak up. And the other school of thought was we cannot politicize ourselves. We lose our respect. We lose our scientific currency and credibility if we engage in that.
There are more and more conferences where scientists get opportunities to get trained in science communication, because the scientific community understands we need to do a much better job in communicating what we're finding.
There's also a lot of research showing that we need what are called intermediaries, those people who can serve that role in the middle, who link the researchers with the policymakers, with practitioners.
So scientists need to learn to really communicate their findings better. And then they need to be involved in shaping and leading the discussion.
I believe that as a scientist, when we see what's going to happen and it's based on science and scientific fact and we know what the implications are, it is our duty, our moral responsibility to speak out.
It's really important to be able to translate your science into plain English. And that doesn't mean dumbing it down. It means thinking really hard about how you communicate effectively.
A lot of my work has focused on facilitating or examining how we can better enable collaborative processes. Having scientists work together with practitioners, with policymakers, with citizens, to enable dialogue, to really understand how can we communicate across these divides.
And here's the way I feel now, is that I need to be advocates for the planet and for the truth. If I can't be an advocate for that, why am I a scientist?
With young people being so involved, does that give me hope for the future? And I would like to say yes, it gives me hope because I feel like the students coming through now do know a lot more than, for example, when I was in school.
These kids are aware of what's coming down the pike and are extremely concerned about it. I have faith that they'll insist on finding solutions to these problems, but they're huge challenges.
I completely understand that things are going to get worse before they get better. The ocean is going to get warmer before it finally starts to cool down. Sea level is going to rise before it's going to go back down. And we're talking about, decades to centuries. But I am hopeful that humans will address this and that life will get better.
We've got youthful, resilient, energetic, passionate young people. We've got great science, and humans over time have learned how to be resilient and adapt.
This next generation is among the most connected, most educated generation in the history of humanity.
When you talk to people that are 25 years and younger, they completely understand this. They want to figure this out. They want to address it, and they're willing to make the sacrifices.
I gotta think that, a new dawn is beginning. And maybe it's going to take, as our species has learned in the past, a few disasters for us to sort of wake up. I hope not. I hope that we don't respond to disasters by building more walls, that we build more bridges.